So Orsini is important within the papal bloodline, and there's a black nobility within the papal bloodline. And people should not be surprised to hear me say that, because one of the things that the bloodlines did, of the nobles, of the Indo-Aryans, which means nobles, of the giants, is that they populated the top two classes worldwide of the four classes.
Throughout the ages, the 13 bloodline families have shaped politics and faith. These children of the fallen manipulate spiritual beliefs for their own benefit, using hidden knowledge and ancient rituals to maintain control. They are tares sown among the wheat, and we need to expose these wolves disguised as sons of light. I recently came across this video, and the presenter is a man called Gary Wayne. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's on a channel called Beyond the Paradigm. He talks about the Jesuits and the 13 bloodline families controlling religion and the world, and it corroborates with some of the information I've been talking about for the past few weeks about the role of the Catholic Church in the end times. Why is this important? It's important because we need to see how these bloodline families seeded those in positions of power in religion and secular spaces. They only allow those with certain bloodlines to rise to the top tier positions. So let's listen to some more of his presentation.
The bloodlines did, of the nobles, of the Indo-Aryans, which means nobles, of the giants, is that they populated the top two classes worldwide of the four classes. And so that not only includes the governingship that we see with the king and the queen and stuff like that, but also the warriors that dominated the army, also owning all of the oligarch companies versus the small free enterprise blacksmith type of things that would be in the third class. They controlled all of the education. They controlled all of the religions, and it was all through their bloodlines that they would have that. And we would know that today as the elite.
And this is why you hear me say that all of these world religions have a pagan root.
One of the interesting thing that goes with the bloodlines is the I am plural, which was a bloodline of majesty, not only as it was understood in Hebrew for the Bible, but in other countries around the Middle East. And so, and I document this in book 2. And so that would be not an ite in this case, because El is the Hebrew word for a god. So it would be Elim, as in, the Nephilim, as in the Gibborim, as in the Horim, as in the Avim, as in the Anakim, on and on and on and on. And that would means, it's a select group that's superior in terms of abilities and qualities to the rest of the population. They're a group of people that has the greatest power and influence within society because of their wealth and their privilege and their inherited wealth and privilege by inference. They're a group of people who, by virtue of their position, their education, their genealogy, exercise all the influence of the society. So this genealogy of people that control the Pope line are part of the black nobility.
Let's make sure we understand what he means when he says black nobility. It's not necessarily talking about skin color. He's talking about the black nobility in Rome. They were the 19th century papal aristocratic families who remained loyal to the Pope. So Roman black nobility means black as in mourning or loyalty, not race. When the Pope was confined, they kept their doors closed to mourn his confinement, which led to the term black nobility. These families have a history of electing the popes and often becoming popes. This tells you why the overwhelming majority of popes come from Italy. So they are distinct from the black aristocracy in Europe, which included Israelites.
So one of the more famous ones of the black nobility are the Borgia family. There's at least two, probably three popes that were Borgia. And Borgia also shows up, and I cover Francis Borgia in book two. He's going to be Grand Master of the Montesa order in Spain. And he's part of the Holy Roman Emperor's court of that time. And he's going to sponsor Ignatius of Loyola and get him out of jail and use his papal bloodline um, ancestors that are, or not ancestors, but relatives, where there's still many of them living in Italy at that time and having great influence, and that they're going to sponsor them into the papal bull. And so it's the Jesuits that become the new Templars.
So you mentioned the Jesuits. I was going to speak to you about them because obviously you mentioned them in the second book. So the Black Pope is obviously a superior Jesuit. Just tell us a little bit about sort of
Yeah,
the start of the Jesuits.
he's the Grand Master, Governor
Yeah,
General, whatever title you want. He's the chief Jesuit.
yeah. So you mentioned Ignatius of Loyola.
Yep.
Tell us about him and what he did.
Yeah, so he comes kind of out of nowhere. He does have Basque bloodlines.
For those who may not know, the Basque people have the highest concentration of Rh negative blood in the world. Scientists can't explain where this blood type came from, and this has led some to suggest that Rh negative blood must be of non human origin.
Which is interesting. Um, and in their mythos, I mean, as you dig into their family mythos, they call themselves Homo Atlantis, which is very interesting. And they say in that mythos that they begat the Egyptian religion, the Sumerian religion, the Scythian religion shortly after the flood. So there were survivors from the antediluvian Atlantis civilization, and then they settled into southwest, southern France and northern Spain. And even their language is distinct. It's distinct from the European languages. It's distinct from Indo-Aryan, and there's, certainly a mystery there and a wonder that goes with those people. And and so when we look at the where Ignatius comes out of, he's not this poor priest, right? He's out of the nobility, just as the Knights Templar founders are all first sons, basically, and second sons of the Royals who are founding the Knights Templar, and two of them are, yes, Cistercian monks. So all that means is that they're maybe third or fourth son if they're a monk, because they're not going to have a position within the direct government, but everybody has a role. And so you start to see that sort of organizational structure that goes with it. So Ignatius of Loyola, he is going to go through a transformation through initiation, not only into the seven sacred sciences that we cover in book one, and they're going to interpret his new religion through the seven sacred sciences, and they're going to be sponsored to become the new Templars to replace the Templars that fell in 1307, and to create the new Babylon and make sure they have control of the banking, and that it's there to convert Roman Catholicism into the new religion for the end time.
Now, I want to pick up here because if you remember from the book we read, The Pope and the Council by Janus, it said that the Jesuits are steering the ship. The end goal is to have a Talmudic religion. So we have the Ish representing Judaism, the Jesuits representing Catholicism, and Freemasons working behind the scenes to bring this to fruition. Listen to this quote from Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. It says, in the 18th century, the Jesuits were charged with having an intimate connection with Freemasonry, and the invention of the degree of Kadash was even attributed to those members of the society who constituted the College of Claremont. This theory of a Jesuitical Freemasonry seems to have originated with the Illuminati. Now, just FYI, you also need to know that there are those who connect the Jesuits to Freemasonry. Jack Chick is quoted as saying the higher order of Jesuits are members of the Masonic Lodge. Former Jesuit Malachi Martin is also quoted as saying that the Jesuits are involved in Freemasonry. Malachi was a Catholic priest, theologian, writer on the Catholic Church, and professor at the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Institute. Now let's look at this article from Marquette EDU. It's talking about the Jesuits. It says the Jesuits, also known as the Society of Jesus, grew out of 6 student companions gathered by Ignatius Loyola at the University of Paris in the 1530s. When their original project of going as missionaries to Palestine was blocked by war, they put themselves at the service of the Pope. Gradually, they came to see the need for rules and structures if their work in union and serving God were to continue and increase. They formed a religious order, elected Loyola as their superior general, and obtained papal approval in 1540. So why did they even see a need for this group? Well, at the time, the Catholic Church was facing the crisis of the Protestant Reformation when the Jesuits were founded. By seeking to break away from Rome, the Protestants encouraged efforts at reform within Catholicism, and they did not want to change. So the Council of Trent clarified Catholic doctrine. The popes largely turned from political power games and art patronage to religious revival, and then new religious orders began to spring up. So I'll drop down. It says initial Jesuit growth was slow in Northern Europe, but rapid in Spain, and most rapid in Portugal and Sicily, where Islam was the threat, not Martin Luther. By 1565, there were 3,500 Jesuits. By 1626, the Jesuits probably reached the zenith of their influence and counted over 15,000 members. Their growth was slower during the next century, largely because they lacked the money to train candidates. So do you see that they were like soldiers who would work to fight against any threat to the church? Now, why would the church give that up? Just think about that. So it says the first Jesuits made their mark as preachers, convent reformers, and missionaries. But in 1548, the Jesuits opened their first college, intended for lay students, at Messina in Sicily. It was an instant success, and petitions for more Jesuit colleges flowed into Rome from most of the cities of Catholic Europe. Quickly, education became the main Jesuit ministry. By 1579, the Jesuits were operating 144 colleges. most admitted students between 12 and 20. In Europe, Asia, and Latin America. By 1749, the Jesuits were staffing 669 colleges and 235 seminaries worldwide. The Jesuit system of education, building on the curriculum devised by Renaissance humanists, was codified in the Ratio Studiorum in 1599. This approach controlled Jesuit education until the late 19th century, when American Jesuit universities began to make adjustments to the conditions in the United States. Now, this is what they say about themselves. They say they enjoy a special relationship with the Pope dating back to their foundation, as Ignatius and the first companions placed themselves at the disposal of the Pope. The society is the only religious congregation, that has a specific vow of obedience to the Pope in regards to mission. Now we're going to read excerpts from this book called The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews. Don't miss that connection. This is talking about the order being made up of Jews and Catholics. Listen, it says Jesuits of Jewish ancestry and purity of blood laws in early society of Jesus. This is a continuation of the relationship between the Pharisees and Rome. Let's remember that a lot of the Pharisees were Edomites. It begins by talking about the historical context of purity of blood discrimination between 1391 and 1547. Archbishop Juan Rujaro is quoted as saying, "New Christians still hold on their lips the milk of their ancestors' recent perversity." Who are the new Christians? That's what they call the Jews. And I'm going to read the text as is for clarity. This says, "The Society of Jesus could not avoid coping with the converso problem because the Jesuits were founded by a group of old and new Christians whose majority, as did their leader Ignatius of Loyola, originated in Iberia. In spite of the universal character of the order envisioned by the founding fathers and of Catholicism per se, the vexed purity of blood concept produced a profound polarization in the society as it tried to implement its mission of conversion. Naturally, both Jesuit supporters and opponents of the purity of blood discrimination sought validation for their arguments in the works that had been employed in the heated discussion that had rent the Iberian Church between the first anti-converso legislation of 1449 and the Jesuit decree that legalized the converso discrimination in 1593. So they made a distinction between old and new Christians, and we need to understand the difference between the two. It says racial tensions played a pivotal role in early Jesuit history. It says, to which the texts of Palmio, Aquavia, Holfius, Rodriguez, Maggio, and many other manuscript sources that we examine in the present book unequivocally testify. Nonetheless, the battle within the order, the Jesuit order, against those Jesuits with Jewish ancestry, or those with black blood, has been insufficiently acknowledged and has even been suppressed. in scholarship on the subject. This is going to tell us how racism was first officially codified in 15th century Spain. It says in 1449, a Toledo edict made racial discrimination legal. It says Spain published an edict you've probably never heard of, but whose effects still resonate today. It was the first set of discriminatory laws based on race. Where did this happen? In Spain. So this says, you probably know about the widespread mistreatment of Jews in Spain, even if your first thought when someone says Spanish Inquisition is a Monty Python sketch. But Spanish and Portuguese anti-Semitism isn't just a historical artifact. So it says, according to historians, the Spanish categorization and treatment of Jews provided the final seedbed for Christian Negrophobic racism. Why is this saying it was Negrophobic racism? It's telling you that those who they are calling Jews in Spain were Negroes. This is why they came up with the purity of blood test and the conception of biological race. So there were those in the church who wanted to exclude the Jesuits who were of the Negro race. It goes on to say the discrimination against Spanish Jews peaked decades earlier in 1391 when a fanatical priest incited anti-Jewish mobs. Can we just go ahead and say anti-Negro mobs? With the slogan, convert or die. A third to a half of the Spanish Jews, the largest community in Europe at the time, were converted to Christianity, the greatest mass conversion in modern Jewish history. Who are they really talking about? Negroes converting to Christianity. Not only that, those Negroes were Israelites. This says some conversos became enormously successful, a success that fostered widespread resentment against these new Christians. Do you see who the new Christians are? It says during a period of political instability in 15th century Castile, conversos, as supporters of the kings, became scapegoats for weak rulers. In some cities, physical battles broke out between old Christians and new Christians. The new Christians were the converted Jews, and they were wealthy. So it says on June 5, 1449, Sarmiento issued the Sentencia Estato, the first set of racial exclusion laws in modern history. Don't miss that. It began in Spain. It barred conversos regardless of whether they were sincere Christians from holding private or public office or receiving land from the church benefices unless they could prove 4 generations of Christian affiliation. Most of them couldn't do that because they were recent converts. So this introduced race into Spain. Conversos, it claimed, came from the perverse lineage of the Jews and thus brought the same harms, evils, and wars which the Jews, the enemies of our holy Catholic faith, have always brought. So they saw the Israelites as enemies of the Catholic faith, whether they were sincere or not, because they needed an excuse to steal their wealth. This says, along with slavery, Spain exported limpieza. In 1552, the Spanish crown decreed that immigrants to America must furnish proof of limpieza. What does that mean? It's a Spanish word that translates to cleanliness. Basically, they wanted them to prove that they were clean. If you had Negro blood, they considered you unclean. Do you see how the one-drop rule began? If you have one drop of Negro blood, you're unclean. It says the Spanish deployed limpieza throughout Spanish America, and the Portuguese adopted it in Brazil. In its new environment, limpieza began to mutate, beginning to refer to an absence of black blood as well as an absence of Jewish blood. You all. So who were the majority of people they unalived during the Inquisition? They were Negroes, Israelites. Again, you see the connection between the church and state. Don't you think the popes could have put an end to this if they really wanted to? This is the history we need to know. It goes on to say the phrase limpieza, or purity of blood, came into common use in the 16th century. The phrase was understood literally, not metaphorically. Medical belief held that blood was the principle of 4 humors in the body because it circulated the other humors. Blood, therefore, played an essential role in establishing a person's character. The most important conflict over limpieza discrimination came in the mid-16th century. The Toledo Archbishop Juan Cilicio, limpieza's strongest proponent, recommended imposing purity of blood restrictions in his archdiocese. But Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, resisted this. He had befriended Spanish conversos at the University of Paris, and some of those people had become founding members of the Jesuits. The man who succeeded him was the order's superior general, and he was a converso. So this says the prominence of conversos within the Jesuits meant it was inevitable that the order would come into conflict with the Archbishop Cilicio. Cilicio banned members of the order from acting as priests without first being personally examined by him. So Loyola was pushing back against this. Now let's quickly look at this to get an understanding of the superior general. This is from Monday Vatican. It tells us that a meaningful stance as the general of the Jesuits is called the Black Pope, because his term of office lasts for the remainder of his life, and because he has unlimited powers like the Pope. So when Pope Francis became Pope, it says it is the first time that the Black Pope has been elected while the White Pope is also a spiritual son of Ignatius. This says Pope Francis is profoundly a Jesuit when he talks about corruption, discernment of the spirits, and the holy hierarchical Mother Church. On the other hand, Jesuits are not necessarily Bergoglian. It is rather the contrary. The fact that the new general, the first coming from South America, identified in intellectual depth a cornerstone of the Jesuit mission, can be interpreted as a choice not to follow Pope Francis in his position. Now let's go back to the article. because it's going to tell us how far-reaching that purity test was. It says, the restrictions went far beyond their effect on the Jesuit order. Iberian initiatives like African race slavery, the discovery of America, the development of plantation agriculture made Lempiza a force in the development of anti-Black racism. Beginning in the 1440s, Spain and Portugal entered the African slave trade, formerly dominated by Islamic countries. The discovery of America and the development of plantation agriculture considerably expanded African slavery. Now don't miss this. It says the main target of Lempiza in the Americas was black blood. It was used to discriminate against Africans, both to justify race slavery and to enforce the distinctions that a race slave system required. The operation of Lempiza in the Americas mimicked its viral spread in Spain. It excluded persons with black blood from civil and religious offices and various fields of commercial endeavor. It was not until 1707 that persons of African descent could take up holy orders. Royal decrees barred university admissions to people with African blood. But do you see how this points back to the Roman Catholic Church? It goes on to say, from Spanish America, Lempiza expanded to influence racial attitudes in the British colonies. By the time slaves were introduced in Virginia, the Spanish had over a century of experience with slavery. The American colonies looked to Latin America to help them develop this peculiar institution. As the historian Alden Vaughan notes, because the Latin American model of lifetime, inheritable servitude was apparent to everyone, Spanish and Portuguese colonists held 250,000 black slaves by 1617. Virginians had no need to invent a new status. The vocabulary the English colonies adopted for race had roots in the Spanish colonies. Negro came into English from Spanish in the mid-16th century, and mulatto a half-century later. Sambo in Spanish, which meant a mix of black and Indian, became a derogatory word for blacks in English. Even the word race came from Spain, where it was used to refer to people of Jewish descent. As the social anthropologist Audrey Smedley explains in Race in America, in fact, race did not appear in the English language with reference to human groups until the 17th century. It is quite likely that the English adopted the term race from the Spanish. While the Spanish used blood in the racial context by the 16th century, the English examples of this period pertain to family relationships of aristocratic descent. It was not until the 18th century that the English colonies used blood in a racial context. This says Memoirs of a Huguenot Family, the account of an American settler in Virginia, printed in 1757, contains a condemnation of miscegenation that incorporates purity of blood concerns. The author writes of whites who mixed with blacks, complaining of this abominable practice, which has polluted the blood of many, among them adding, "We should not have smutted or dirtied our blood." Now listen to what Thomas Jefferson said. It says, he expressed similar concerns about miscegenation. He said that blacks should be removed beyond the reach of mixture so that they could not stain the blood of their master. Now, can you believe this? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Do you see the hypocrisy and the wickedness of some of these people? Was he saying they should be removed because he couldn't keep his hands off of Sally Hemings? Or is that how the system of duality actually works? They say one thing in public, but behind the scenes, they're engaging in the very thing they pretend to be against. Constantine, representing the state, took what was given to us, the way. The way was the blueprint of the ways of the Most High Yah. Constantine made the way a state religion because it had been injected with the leaven of the Pharisees and syncretized with the paganism already practiced in Rome. Before that, the way was a threat. So imagine Constantine confiscating the blueprint and getting into a car, and then he drives off with a woman. The woman represents the church that was birthed out of the bread now tainted with leaven. Church and state drives around the world under the pretense of evangelism. When you look at those colonizing and terrorizing the world, going around stealing the resources of others, unaliving people for doing the same things they do, it's proof that tares were planted with the wheat. Think about the secret organizations attached to these religions, and you can see that they are promoting the doctrine of devils. It's not a coincidence that the Roman Catholic Church is always involved in sex scandals, particularly when it comes to the young ones. And just think, the Rev 29ers do the same thing. It's a continuation of the rituals and sacrifices practiced in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. But it all began in Babylon. Religion allowed the seed of the fallen to control the wealth and riches of the world through deception. What was offered to Messiah when he was tempted in the wilderness? All the kingdoms of the world. Let's tie all of this together. The Jesuits that we've been talking about played a significant role in the context of the papal bulls about colonization, mainly through the papal bull Inter Caetera. That was the papal bull authorizing Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas. They used evangelism as the justification and the lie about black skin being a curse. But what was the main objective? To enrich the bloodline families. This says the Jesuits, as a religious order, were involved in missionary work in the Americas, which was often aligned with the Spanish crown. So the missionaries were collecting intel as they pretended to spread the gospel. They had the Bible in one hand and the weapons in the other. It goes on to say that the Jesuits' mission and the papal bull were intertwined as they sought to spread Christianity and serve the interests of the colonial powers. Once again, you see duality. These folks are two-faced, but in spite of their efforts, some benefited from the wheat that had been planted. Remember, the wheat and tares are growing up together, and this is why we are told to look at the fruit. They say they believe the same gospel and do all of the Christianese stuff while feeding little ones to alligators. If you tuned in for the live session this past week, I talked about how they use the folks in our community against us. Specifically, how the Catholic Church wanted to use their influence to promote Catholicism. The link will be in the description for those who have not watched it. But you need to understand that these stars and celebrities that they raise up in our communities are being used to help the kingdom of darkness, most of them. These folks can't just walk away without a fight because they took the bait and profited from the platform that was given to them. So when they try to leave, things go terribly wrong for them. Yes, they may have certain gifts and talents, but the enemy wants to use it to benefit his kingdom. They can't just walk away without a fight. They took the bait, they profited, and when they try to leave, henchmen are sent after them to rein them back in and make them pay, sometimes with their lives. Why? Because money was invested to make them a celebrity. Folks get caught up because they look at how much money they can make. The love of money is the root of all evil. Do you see how diabolical this system is? We have to wake up. We're going to end it there. Hopefully this message has been a blessing to you. Please remember to hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.